Well, when I was talking to Jeremy, he said, well, I'm going to warm them up for you, and I figured now I'm going to let you down. Anyway, but I think there's a lot of common themes that I think will be good to get into. Some of the things that were discussed in the panel and from Jeremy's presentation. And then I'm going to hopefully that we'll have about 10, 15 minutes for questions, because that's sort of where I get a little return on my investment, and I learn a lot that way. So, okay, let's talk about Kern and what it means. A lot of what, even Jeremy and people working out in China Lake, what they do is it's kind of a real economy. And the real economy is what provides opportunity. I've lived in Southern California for well over 40 years. And one of the most distressing things to me has been how that society has become more and more bifurcated between those who have and those who don't, and a political class that really doesn't interest itself very much in upward mobility. And I think this is going to be one of the big themes that's going to determine where our society goes in the next 20 or 30 years. It's one of the reasons why we had this unusual result in the election. One of the things I think is going to really have a big effect on Bakersfield is lower housing prices. That's probably your biggest advantage in terms of people who want to stay in California. The danger I see is that people are going to say, well, why should I go to Bakersfield or Riverside or Modesto? Why don't I just go to another state and get away from the lunatics in Sacramento? So that's possibly an issue. But there is an advantage here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about generational dynamics. You're going to hear some things that you're probably not used to. And again, the big problem that Kern has, and really almost all of interior California has, is it simply doesn't have the economy that the people in Sacramento, particularly our illustrious governor, really want. Do you really want to produce stuff? We'll just think about ideas and we'll get rich that way. And of course, that doesn't work for most people. So one of the things we talk about is, does stuff matter? I think we live increasingly in an age where everyone thinks, well, I'll just think about things, or I'll design something, or I'll have a program. And that real stuff doesn't matter at all. And that really was sort of the way that this country has been evolving generally, but even more so in California. And in some ways, all the good things that have happened in Silicon Valley have had a negative effect in that we forgot, well, what about the middle class? What about having a diversified economy? What about, don't we have to eat? Don't we have to power our screensavers? And don't we have to do all these things in the real world? And actually, that they do matter. So one of the big things that people don't talk about is what is called a multiplier effect. In other words, things like agriculture, manufacturing, generate a tremendous amount of other economic effects down the road. After all, if you're a manufacturer, then you have a marketing person, you probably need an accountant. You're generating wealth. So what we see is economies that produce these kinds of opportunities are economies that generally help the rest of things around them. Whereas like if you're just doing something, let's say, like a software program, it has an effect, but it doesn't have the same effect in terms of jobs and how it goes through the economy. So we have lots of factors that we don't even talk about. We talk about agriculture. I happen to have spent a good part of my, well, I guess somewhat less than ideal youth, but I had some good times. I spent a lot of time in Bakersfield. I keep looking for where Falsity rules our town. I remember, anyone remembers that sign? Or, I remember cruising Chester. And what I remember is that Bakersfield had this sort of special thing with this tie to the real economy. And agriculture, for instance, one of our key industries, is almost completely forgotten. It has very, very little priority, most particularly in Sacramento. And I think, but that's created a lot of the opportunity that Bakersfield provides. Then we take a look at energy. Now, it's been predicted that, well, we won't need oil, we won't need gas. Well, I don't know, somehow there is a sense that we don't need these kinds of basic industries. But if you look at what's happening in the world, despite all the talk about climate change, The reality is more and more countries are demanding more and more energy. And by the way, all those little devices that Apple and Google power also need a lot of energy. So there's an enormous amount of demand. So the energy industry should not be written off as it is largely. And as you can tell, shale oil, we have some big deposits in this area. This is changing everything. Probably, when people say, whatever you might think of Trump, if you say, well, he's a stooge of the Russians, well, the two things that if I was the Russians I would not like is more American energy production and a stronger U.S. military. So, if he's being a Russian agent, he's a kind of screwed up one. So the fact is, we are in the midst of what could be a tremendous economic change. Just imagine the fact that we could produce enough energy so we could tell the Saudis and the Iranians and the Russians to, go wherever we want them to go. We don't have to worry about what they care about. And so I think this is very important and a great opportunity. And I'm just hoping that the policy changes will allow for this development to continue here. And again, you have their struggle with Sacramento, which I'll get into a little bit later. The energy industry employs many, many more people than most of the big economic sectors. It pays more. It obviously had a huge rise, and it's dropped some. Whether it comes back, I think it's fairly likely. The question is whether it will come back anywhere in California. As you know, over the last few years, energy companies are more and more leaving California, feel hostile climate. I remember talking to somebody high up in a big oil company that still happens to be based in California. You don't have to think too long about what company it is. And basically saying that going to school in the Bay Area, his kids were actually harassed because their dad worked for an oil company. That's not the best atmosphere you can have. The big thing is that the energy industry is a very, very high-paying, high-value industry, and that value is spread along a large part of the class divide. One of the big problems we've had in California is the kind of growth that we have is very concentrated in a few sectors that have generated tremendous wealth, but they don't employ a lot of people. They certainly don't employ a lot of minorities. And so one of the big issues we have in California is the nature of our economy not being able to create opportunities for a broad amount of the population. And yet this is a very important sector for our economy. When we looked at intellectual property, the intellectual property is about 6–10% of our GDP exports. Manufacturing, it represents a much larger part. And obviously the import substitution that we get from energy is an enormous boost to the American economy. There's a reason why much of the growth that took place in the United States over the last decade took place in energy-producing states and energy-producing counties. And it's also where there's been more productivity gains. One of the things we forget about, we say, well, there's high tech and there's manufacturing. Well, close to half the scientists and engineers in America work for manufacturing companies. So sort of this idea that we can have this economy that's sort of ephemeral and that it will work out is really not actually the truth. And again, you take a look at where, again, the high value-added drivers are, and again, it's the same pattern, manufacturing and other of these old, unfashionable industries. Now, one of the things that we can see is what has been the effect here in Kern County and Bakersfield. And as you can see, although not as fast as, let's say, someplace like Austin or even to some extent Riverside, Bakersfield has very, very solid job growth and has had it over a long period of time. So that's one of the reasons why I would call it an opportunity region. And this is probably the most important chart maybe of all. And what it really talks about is what we call middle wage occupations. These are jobs that pay between 40, they're in this, between the 40% and the 80% of earners. And this has been the big problem in California. What we have in California increasingly is a lot of very low-end jobs and a few high-end jobs. But Kern has done a better job of creating those kinds of jobs, much more similar in some ways to what you see in large parts of Texas. I cannot think of a more important issue for the future of California and the future of the country than providing more middle-income jobs. And I think Kern has done a pretty good job, and a lot of it is because it still does a lot of the basic things. And interestingly enough, STEM jobs. Done very well in creation of STEM jobs over the last 15 years. One of the better ones in the country. What we forget about is that STEM employment in some areas has actually been going down. Right now, Los Angeles, which when I first came to California and started writing about it, Los Angeles had the largest concentration of scientists and engineers in the world. It now has a location quotient for that below the national average. So there's been a huge hollowing out of some of the STEM economy, but it's gotten stronger here in Kern, and I think that's a very good sign. Now, the other big issue, and I think maybe the biggest issue coming up and really affecting California overall, is housing affordability. Now, basically what we do is it's a median multiple. It's basically the price of housing compared to income. So we're normalizing for income. And as you can see, many of the most expensive places in the United States are in California: San Jose, LA, San Francisco, San Diego. Well, you can see California's doing pretty well. We dominate the most unaffordable places in the country. And of course, one of the reasons that is because the state has a policy that makes it very, very difficult to build new housing, particularly the single-family housing that most people actually prefer. So guess what happens? You have less supply, you have higher prices. I always say to my wife, we should send a Christmas card to Jerry Brown because his policies are making our house in Orange County worth more and more every year. Because, again, if you cut off the supply. But Bakersfield has an opportunity. I mean, when you look at your median multiples, it's not really that far off from the big Texas cities, which have been gaining migrants from California. What we see is there's a direct relationship between housing price and where people migrate. That's pretty clear. So a lot of times we hear, oh, everybody's moving, to San Francisco, or everybody's moving to New York. Actually, that's not where the growth is. And in the case of New York State, it's actually losing population. If we take a look at population growth in California, you can see, again, Bakersfield, Riverside, Stockton, Sacramento, Modesto, all growing much faster than the other parts, and particularly of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has one of the slowest growth rates of any major metropolitan area in the country right now. So basically what you have is you have very high housing prices, which make it extraordinarily difficult for people to move to certain parts of the country, and this will become more important in the future. We take a look at domestic migration. The good news for Bakersfield is you have positive domestic migration that's moving from one place in the country to another. You're probably doing better than a lot of places over this longer period. But I have to say that one thing that is a little disturbing is that in recent years, you've actually had net out migration. And what we think is happening, and I think it could conceivably get worse, is the state policy, both economically and on housing, is sort of driving people who would have gone to Kern County, would have gone to the Inland Empire, would have gone into the San Joaquin Valley. And they're saying, well, still the prices are too high. Why don't I just go to, fill in the blank, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Houston, Dallas. So there's a problem that's developing. We're already seeing, by the way, in the Inland Empire, where the median multiple is now getting to 5 or 6, that we're seeing a big slowdown in both economic and population growth. So there is a little warning sign there. What we're seeing generally is, one of the things I always find is that today's progressives, as opposed to, let's say, my day's progressives, say, God, isn't it great? California's losing all the poor people and we're getting all the smart, rich people. I don't know, that's progressivism today. The reality is actually not what's really happening. This is the IRS data. The IRS data is the best data that we can get on who's coming, who's going out of California. Where we're losing and where Texas in particular is gaining is 35 to 44. So there's a lot of talk about millennials, and I'll get into that too, but a lot of the talk about millennials kind of misses the point. The 35 to 44 is going to be the biggest growth area in the US over the next few years for all sorts of demographic reasons. We're sort of at the peak of millennials. And so what's going on now is we are losing very badly there. By the way, on income and education, we're also losing. So since 2010, California has been losing more and more of its middle class, and particularly losing the 35 to 44. Guess what? That's when people get married and start procreating. Now, the belief is, well, people don't want to live in single-family houses. They all want to live close. And, there was some of this in the earlier panel, and I don't mean to be a little bit disagreeable, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of these ideas about millennials are sort of stock, stock phrases, and you hear them over and over again. But when you look at the numbers, it turns out that actually millennials, despite appearances, are actually fairly human. And when you ask them the question, where do you want to live when you get older, they are actually more interested in having a single-family house and living what we might call suburban lifestyle than even their parents. So, I mean, what's really interesting is how we have ideas about the world that are maybe not exactly as right as we think they are. So we take a look at house purchases under the age of 35. Oh, well, don't they all want to live in a crate by a bus stop? I mean, isn't that their goal in life? Well, 81% want a detached house. I mean, this is something that, again, Bakersfield can provide that is becoming almost impossible to find in many parts of California. Now, here's a really important thing to understand. We were talking earlier about, you needed to have a brew pub, and, I guess they didn't mention the marijuana shop, but that would have been probably appropriate as well. All these things that the kids want. Well, there's a problem. The baby boomers created the millennials. In other words, they're called the echo boomers. So you have a very big generation because the boomers were a very big generation. That very big generation was created by all the people coming back from the military in World War II and, let's just say, using their unexpended energy. But here's what's happening. When people when they're young, yeah, living in the city is really attractive, and, they don't really care about their quality of life. They don't know where they're going to sleep anyway. So, for them, it's okay to live in the city. But look what happens from 25 to 29 to 35 to 39. It just drops. What happens is people actually grow up. Now, millennials, because they have a lot of challenges, are growing up a little slower. But the reality is that there are very good signs that actually they're looking for things not so different than their parents. Now, this shows you what's happening demographically, which is after 2018, we will have more millennials basically over the age of 30 than under. So as they grow up, their demands are going to be different. They're going to be looking for different things. When people say, oh, what about urban design? Once you have kids, Main Street Disneyland is about as good as it gets. So the fact is, we're going to see over the next 30, 40 years, a much larger increase in 30-somethings and 20-somethings, which means that the design that people want, the kind of communities that they want, the kind of places that they want are going to change along with it. And so, as one demographer put it, we've already hit peak urban millennials. And as millennials actually become adults, too slowly for most of us, what we're going to see is a demand for many of the things that Bakersfield can offer: affordable housing, community, nice places to live, and hopefully jobs as well. That's one of the reasons why Bakersfield has become a place that actually millennials are going to. I was doing some work in Southern California, and the big increase in Southern California is in the Riverside, San Bernardino area. So I'm convinced every millennial who moves to downtown LA has been interviewed 20 times, and all those people who moved to Riverside, they don't even exist. I mean, so we're forgetting even where the populations are growing and where they live. Actually, the big growth in millennials are exactly in places like Bakersfield and Riverside, but nobody seems to be paying attention to that. If we take a look, the other big change, obviously, is going to be ethnic. Bakersfield is going to change. It's already changing, and so you're going to see big increases in the Latino population and the Asian population in particular. That's going to be something that we have to pay attention to, because you don't want to mix the issue of class and race at the same time, or else you're going to have a very toxic stew. As you can see, the changes in the Bakersfield, Kern County population is basically now the Hispanic population is basically around the majority. Now, one of the biggest issues that I deal with, and I'm dealing with all over the country, is we have a generation coming up that's heavily non-Anglo, don't have a lot of inherited wealth, and what our prices are doing here in California is essentially chasing exactly the kind of people that Jeremy was talking about, chasing those kind of people out of the state once they get to the age of wanting to settle down, buy a house, have kids. You know, that whole group, that's who we're losing. And it's going to happen with a large part of our minority population. So what we need to do is we need to say, how do we fix that situation? How do we create more opportunities? When you compare home ownership rates, for instance, in Dallas with Los Angeles, both by age and by race, the differences are extraordinary. That you'll have 30, 40% home ownership rates, let's say, among African Americans, as opposed to 20, 25% and going down. We have a report coming out on millennial housing, will be out in May, and the numbers are, particularly in the big metros, are particularly poor. So I just want to add just a few things. These are the people who run the state. So given the fact that class and the future of upward mobility is the most important pressing issue, we have a state that doesn't care about it at all. They say green jobs. I always thought green jobs are something that, it's something we tell our kids so they go to sleep at night. This idea that we have to force density. If people want dense housing, that's great. Do we force it? Do we make it so that single-family homes are impossible to build where they are economically feasible, and we're going to just have those prices go up? High-speed rail, I'm sure you're all familiar with Jerry's choo-choo. And meanwhile, we're riding on some of the worst roads in America. We have infrastructure that's falling apart. California spends the least percentage of its revenue on infrastructure of any state in the union. I don't know, it doesn't seem like a great strategy. And basically, it's all about social engineering. At this level, that's where California is coming in. We are going to change how people in California live for our particular set of what is right and what is wrong. And you're basically just guinea pigs in that study. For instance, on the idea, well, we'll build more density, that will lead to cheaper housing. Actually, density is more expensive to build than single family or townhouses. So actually building high density is not going to solve the property problem. And if you don't believe that, I have a bridge in New York that'd be really good to walk over. Commuting. We're all going to ride the bus. What's happening is the biggest change is working at home. And actually, in Los Angeles, we've spent somewhere between $16 and $20 billion on a light rail system that has seen the actual share of people taking transit drop. And ridership continues to drop for lots of reasons. People taking Uber and Lyft, people working at home. So the state is investing its resources and its policy in something that's actually declining. And by the way, I always wanted to know, how come working at home doesn't count as being good for the planet? I mean, you don't even turn your car on. That's probably the best thing of all. But nevertheless, we have completely screwed up our priorities. And who pays for that? Well, the taxpayer and all the people who have to sit on roads because, I don't know if you're familiar that Jerry wants us on a road diet. Our roads are too good. They're too big. They work too well, so we got to make them worse than they already are. So, this is kind of not the most positive environment. In the work on CO2 emissions, which is the justification for all that, bottom line is, this is a study in Australia. Actually, people in dense cities actually use more energy per capita. One of the reasons it has to do with the urban heat island effect, which is that like if you build high rises in downtown Phoenix. I don't know how you could heat things up faster. But the bottom line is a lot of this rhetoric that you're getting from the state is actually not even scientifically supportable. And this is one of my favorites. We did a study of California's greenhouse gas emissions, and what we figured out is all the people that we've chased out of the state and the industries we've chased out of the state are now generally moving to places where controls are less and the climate is harsher. And so actually the net effect has been absolutely nothing. So what's weird is after all this, we're actually not affecting the climate at all. And by the way, if California fell into the ocean tomorrow, it would have no effect on the climate. Might have effect on real estate values in Nevada, but so I mean, this is all, to me, it's all about vanity. It's all about preening. It's all about being able to get the support of the media and being seen as a great hero. It really isn't about the climate, and it really isn't certainly about making people's lives better. So here's just a few things just to close, and I hope we'll have a little time for questions. We got to deal with California and its crazy policies. We have to look at how do we promote more high-wage jobs, and also how do we promote more affordable housing. If you take all the demographic factors and the economic factors, the Kern County should be really the center of a California revival that is not just about billionaires in Silicon Valley, but it's about the great middle class of the state, which is being left behind by conscious state policy. So thank you very much.
And yes, we'd like to open it up for questions. And Joe, I had a car ride over yesterday. I apologize, he had 30 minutes in a traffic jam listening to me. But I really appreciate his message on social mobility, and we're really the best practice location. #1 in the country for social mobility is where we're standing today. So questions, comments? Well, question, no comment. Yeah, Mark Evans, Dr. Evans from Cal State. We're going to bring a microphone to you.
We have a microphone?
Yeah, we're going to, no teleworking. We're going to actually bring it to you.
Have you seen any studies that break down what % of the growth in the millennial population is natural increase versus in-migration in Kern County?
I mean immigration.
Yeah, it'd be immigration because that's coming in.
Well,
and the domestic is actually 0 or negative at this point.
California's growth rate, which used to be much higher than the national average, is about the national average now. The natural increase, which is what people do naturally, is basically where our population growth comes from, because we lose some. Interesting thing, immigration to California is actually dropping, and particularly to Los Angeles. Immigrants are going to other places. You know, I've been in Nashville, and there's been like little Somalia and little Kurdistan and little Mexico. If you take a look at where Hispanic and Asian immigrants are moving increasingly, they're moving to more affordable places. Now, that could be very good for Bakersfield, but it is certainly something we're not taking advantage of. People, you know, when we think about people coming from abroad, what are they coming from? They're coming for the American dream. They're not, you know, people say, well, you know, people from Asia, they just want to live in crowded places. And I said, well, they want to live in crowded places. They could have stayed home. I mean, the fact is, when you go and you talk to people who've come from Asia or from Mexico or from the Middle East, their dream is a single-family house in a suburban neighborhood for the vast majority. And the harder we make that, the more we are going to lose the immigrant population for sure. And as I was showing before, I think we're also going to be losing a lot of our millennial and population, particularly as they get into their 30s.
We have time for a few more questions. Any other questions? In the back, have the microphone coming.
Thank you very much for the talk, very interesting. I just wanted to ask you about the impact of President Trump's proposal to deport illegal immigrants and all who make up a large percentage of the economy in Kern County as part of the agriculture industry. So is there any studies done to kind of understand what the impact on the economy might be as a result of those forced deportations in terms of GDP for our county?
Well, I don't think anyone's done much in the way of studies because you can't study something that hasn't happened. It's a little bit difficult. But fundamentally, first of all, we have to remember which president in American history deported the most undocumented aliens? Obama, 2 million people. Somehow that wasn't the problem. Right? Meryl Streep didn't get upset about that. So, I mean, I think we're going to continue to have this. I think with immigration policy, we really have to really take out what we're doing now and replace it with something else. And that would include moving more to the Canadian system where we actually look for what's good for us economically. The Canadians, the Australians do this. In terms of the undocumented, I think those who aren't criminals, basically felons, I think, should be allowed to stay. I think the idea of going and pulling people out of their homes is not very attractive. But I do think that what we really want to do is move more to skilled immigration. The undocumented, if they should be asked to apply for citizenship, but they go to the back of the line because the people who came in legally shouldn't be disadvantaged. And then we may have to look at things, particularly for agriculture, programs that bring in people to work on a sort of special work visa. On the other hand, the H-1B visas, I think, basically take jobs from middle-class Americans. All the kids who Jeremy is educating who get STEM educations, and then their jobs are lost to people who are basically indentured servants from a foreign country. That's not a good immigration policy. So I don't agree with a lot of President Trump's ideas on immigration if those ideas are really solid anyway. But on the other hand, I do think it's time to have a debate because what we've been doing doesn't work. And as our economy evolves, importing large numbers of people with minimal educations and skills is not very good, and particularly very difficult for those poor people who already exist here.
Okay. Any other? Hopefully we have a couple more.
Hi.
Great. Wayne?
Thanks for coming today. That was terrific. You made a few comments about the state's road infrastructure, how it's been failing and not being, it's not supporting the 40 million people that live here now. It was designed for 20 million people when we had 10 million people in the state. We just had one of the rainiest seasons on record, yet most of that water is going to flow out into the Pacific. We've had the scare of the Oroville Dam recently. How bad, in your opinion, does it have to get before we fix it?
Well, I don't know. It's pretty bad now, and we're not doing much. I'm very glad you asked that question because the water policy obviously is a big deal here. I heard a lot about water when I was a kid spending a lot of time here because my friend's father, my roommate's father was a grower, so I heard all about water. Basically, we're not keeping up with the infrastructure. One of the reasons Oroville happened is we didn't maintain it. What I find really bizarre is if you believe climate change is inevitable and it's going to produce effects, which I'm not in a position to say yes or no, but let's just say you agree. That means we have more rain, less snow. So why don't we think about how do we catch the rain and store it? I mean, but see, I think fundamentally the environmental agenda increasingly is we don't really want that water to be available for farmers or be available for people to live. Fundamentally, we'd be happier if everybody left, or as many people who don't vote for us leave. So I think that one of the big things is we have to look at this whole infrastructure issue. And what's great tragedy is the greatest builder of infrastructure in California's history was the father of the current governor. And from my point of view, it is much more progressive to do what you described, getting ready for the population. You had 10 million people, we're going to be ready for 20. And now to say, okay, if we're going to get to 40 or 35 to 40, what is it that we need? And I think we're just simply not doing this. We're building the choo-choo, which may never actually get built. But meanwhile, the real problem in California isn't getting from LA to San Francisco. The problem in California is getting around from one part of LA to another. we're not thinking about new technologies. We're not a leader. You know, when I first moved to California in 1971 and to Southern California in 75, I was always astounded how great our infrastructure was relative to where I came from, which was New York. Now, New York has crummy infrastructure, and we have crummy infrastructure. But when you go to places like Texas, they're constantly building new roads, and they're constantly thinking about how to meet future demand. So I think in a funny way, a lot of it's attitudinal. I think the people who run California have a very tired view of what California is capable of. I think they see a society where a lot of people don't work. They're supported by you know, the beneficence of Mark Zuckerberg, and basically we don't need good infrastructure. After all, if you have the cloud, who needs infrastructure? So I think that this water issue is just illustrative of lots of delays. You know, when you ask people around the country, well, why did I leave? Let's say, why did you leave LA or the Bay Area? The basic things you'll hear is traffic, poor schools, and basically a climate that was very hard to start a business. And unless we start to address those issues, I think we're going to continue to have this outmigration, a slow, steady outmigration of certain kinds of businesses that employ middle-class people and middle-class people themselves. You have to be able to develop the infrastructure. California is not a natural place for 30, 35 million people. The water's in one area and the people are in another, and the good land is in one area and the water's in a different place. And it was the genius of Pat Brown and his predecessors that made California possible, created this middle-class dream, and right now Sacramento's trying to stomp on that dream as much as possible.
And your last book was called The Human City, The New Urbanism. So what are you planning on penning next?
Well, I'm thinking about writing a book about the movement towards feudalism in the United States.
Okay. That should be a page turner.
I mean, the bottom line is, what kind of society do we want to have? I mean, can you think about this? We have a generation, the first generation in American history, that is likely to live at a lower standard than their parents. That has never happened. A country like the United States exists, as Jeremy pointed out, on sort of aspiration, picking yourself off the floor. If we start giving up on that, I don't know what's left of the American dream. So but what I'm trying to say is, look, we don't want to move to the kind of society that we have, where certain people have enormous, unbelievable amounts of money, unbelievable amounts of power, because that comes with the money, and the middle class is shrinking. That is not socially sustainable over time.
Well, and if I'll do a plug for your website, newgeography.com, because Bakersfield, Kern County always does very well on your, I think, very realistic weighted system. So, check that website out. And any final, 1, 2 more questions? Great. Well, please tell everybody.
Well, I think you got one.
Yes.
Yeah.
What kind of economic impact will the train have in Kern County if it ever is built?
Well, it wouldn't be the same impact as improving 99. I don't know what the impact is going to be, because, fundamentally it's going to be very expensive, and it's going to be, I don't know. Do you all feel the great need to go to Modesto in a train quickly? And when you get there, how are you going to get to where you actually want to go, because the station probably isn't remotely close? I mean, this kind of social engineering, instead of saying, what is it that people need? And what they need is they need the basic infrastructure to be finished. The idea that you would spend billions on something that may be marginally useful while everything else is falling apart makes no sense at all.
Well, and then you could argue technology, you're actually not out of the office when you're on an Amtrak because of Wi-Fi and your cell, that maybe you're even more productive because someone's not banging on your office door, right?
Well, I just think that there's so many technological changes. Another thing we're working on is transportation. We have completely new transportation options that are going to be great for a place like Bakersfield. As you move towards autonomous vehicles, as you move to more of a Uber Lyft model, Well, that solves a lot of the transportation problems also for people who don't drive, for aging people. And so, you know, what strikes me is California is filled with all this amazing creativity and innovation, and yet we're not applying it as in the realm of public policy.
Well, thank you, Joel, and tell the people in LA that we're not 5 hours away and that we have great investment opportunities. Thank you again.
Thank you.